Hi, everybody. Welcome to another session of Discovery, our Friday sessions, where we celebrate Friday and also learn a little bit. Apologies for the brief delay. We had a few technical difficulties in the background, but here we are, ready to go. So before we get started, my name is Alison Mostowich. I am the Director of Engagement for Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Calgary, Alberta, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. We are a remote workplace, so while I'm in Calgary, Efficiency Canada is actually based at Carleton University, which is located in the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. So before we get started, just a reminder that our lovely speakers are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions from all of you. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen that you'll see, and you can actually upvote those questions. So if you like them in the Q&A box, that increases the probability that they will get asked. So I encourage you to use that function. So with that, I am very pleased to welcome again our guests today. We have Olivier Cappon, who is the Senior Director, Business Development and Government Relations at CIET. And we also have Geneviève Gauthier, National Director, Strategic Innovations with Econoler. So they are going to provide us with some examples of carbon neutral projects, how these projects can affect electricity use and costs, what programs may exist to offset projected costs, and then what type of resources an organization needs to get started on these. So with that, please join me in welcoming Olivier and Geneviève. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much. I'll just start with sharing my screen. First, thanks to everyone for this interest in the subject. It's always nice to be asked back to do a second round of something that we did. I want to say, Geneviève, I think we did it back in May. So it's great to be all online with everyone again and back to the discovery sessions for the fall. What we'd like to do here today, so Alison just talked about some of the topics that we'll cover. We're going to go over some of the basic information about the pathways to carbon neutrality, why it's important. We're just going to do a quick review of some of the key concepts for those that may not be as familiar. And then we'll get into a dialogue between myself and Geneviève. I've got some poignant questions for her, and then we'll open up the discussion to all of you. And hopefully as we're dialoguing and I'm asking Geneviève questions, there will be things that will come to mind that you might want to ask us as well. I know we only have a finite amount of time. We'll get started. Geneviève, maybe I'll call on you to speak to these first couple of slides, starting with that one.
Yes, thank you, Olivier, for the nice introduction. And thank you again, FC Canada, for the invitation. There's a lot to answer, a lot to say in 20 minutes, Olivier. I'm not sure if we did not oversell that, but we'll try to make our time valuable. Just quick intro before we engage into discussion with Olivier, and the most interesting part, questions from participants. We wanted to show that slide because to understand the level of GHG emissions in Canada, it's often like I'm there because I'm a CIET trainer. I teach carbon neutrality. I've been teaching it for about 3 years now. And at Econoler, we also do like carbon neutral strategy with organization. And the questions I'm sometimes asked by clients is, I emit 50,000 tons per year. Is it large? Is it small compared to Canada's emissions? So that's a question often we're asked, is my emissions is related to the Canadian emissions. So you have the graph in front of you. The one thing that's interested as part of Energy Efficiency Canada webinar is the energy efficiency part of carbon neutral strategy that we'll talk about in a bit more detail. But what I would like to pinpoint on that graph is that, as you would expect, carbon dioxide is the main gas contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. It's mainly coming from the combustion of fossil fuel. But for those of you who are also working in the building environment, ACs, PFC, and so on and so forth, the refrigerant are also contributing to gas efficiency. So most often when we talk about carbon neutral strategy in the building environment anyway, we'll try to look at, but most of the attention would always go to the CO2, the emissions for the combustion. I'll go very quick on that because that's the second webinar we gave, and I'm assuming most of you are familiar with it, but just to make sure everybody understands the basic language associated to GHG emissions. So when we talk about scope 1, we talk about direct emissions. So those are the emissions at the site. For instance, you use natural gas in your boiler, that will be considered direct emissions. The gasoline you use for your car fleet within your organization will also be direct emissions. And for some specific case, those who have to treat their own waste. For instance, some university campus, I'm thinking about an organization we work with, Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, where they do have to manage their own organic waste, then the emissions associated to that will be scope 1 emissions. But let's say that most of the time, scope 1 emissions will basically be the fuel that it's burned in the stationary equipment that you have on site. So it's really energy related for most of it. For scope 2 is indirect emission. The one source of scope 2 emissions that everybody has is electricity. So we consume electricity. While I use electricity to power my computer, my phone, anything like that, I'm not emitting on site, obviously, greenhouse gas emissions, but the electricity I consume has been produced elsewhere, maybe by a natural gas power plant, or maybe it's a district system. So I'm consuming steam, and that steam has been produced with oil or natural gas and so on, because the emissions has been emitted to produce and transmit me steam or electricity. Then that will be my scope 2 emissions. And then in scope 3 that I would just touch upon, because it's most organizations that do have targets, carbon neutrality target or GHG emission reduction target, will try to scope their target with scope 1 and scope 2, meaning that we'll say, okay, we'll become carbon neutral for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions only. More and more we see some targets that will involve scope 3. Scope 3 is very vague. It's a bit difficult sometimes to quantify, but it's everything that's upstream the value chain and downstream the value chain. So it might be the carbon footprint of the raw material you use, for instance, in an industrial process, and how is your material or product used by the end users, for instance, and the impact it will have on GHG emissions. The scope 3 emissions that are mostly in the inventory most of the time will be something that's related to employee commuting to work. So if I drive a car to go to work, I'm burning gasoline to go to work. So some organization will consider that type of emission as scope 3. So in a nutshell, because we can talk quite a long time about scope 3 emissions, but scope 3 emission is everything that is necessary for your activities, but that is not directly related to it. If you are interested in scope 3, try to get a better idea of what it is. Go and look for the report. The title of the report is at the bottom of the slide, and that's probably one of the references that you can read first to really try to understand what are the scope 3 emissions, both upstream and downstream. So it was very quick, and the training would take maybe an hour to explain all of that, but let's switch into the question and discussion.
What's good about me asking you some questions, Geneviève, is you'll get to take a breath now before you answer this first question. Let's get into this first. In the Becoming a Carbon Neutral course, I've seen you talk about the importance of inventories and how keeping a good inventory can be the most difficult step, even though it would seem that it's quite a basic step. Why is
there are multiple components to the answer. As you may have seen, governments and some organizations sometimes are saying we want to reduce our emissions by 40% based on 1990 levels, which is really the first reference here that was stated by the CIET agreement. And the issue when you do that is that in order to get your 1990 inventory, if you have not done it in the 1990s, it's almost impossible to have it. So we've worked with clients where we see people trying to say, we'll have a target based on 1990, and they try to figure and estimate what was the real GHG emissions at that time. But when you do that, or when you have an inventory that is not clear and precise, we'll always come back with what we see in energy efficiency, right? What you don't measure, you can't manage. It's very difficult, almost impossible to come with a nice structured strategy that will look at what's feasible, cost effective, and how to prioritize those different actions if you have an inventory that's not good. Concerning the inventory, there are different ways of doing. There are GHG protocol, that's mostly the most recognized protocol to do an inventory. But for those organizations that are into the ESG and carbon disclosure and all that, or landscape or guides around like declaring your GHG inventory, all have a slight differences. So I was talking to a lawyer like 2 days ago, and she was telling me that for some organization, for public organization, having inventory or declaring inventory, making public inventory that are not accurate could potentially put them at risk to have legal challenge.
Actually, in In your opening remarks, you hinted at the fact that organizations usually want to compare their emissions and see how they compare to Canada's overall emissions and reduction goals. Obviously, I take it to assume that's not a particularly good way for an organization to look at that. Is there a way for an organization to easily be able to compare their emissions to companies of similar size, scale, and profile?
That's a good question, Olivier. Not that I know of. If some are in the industrial sector, for instance, there are some organizations that will work with consultant to do the inventory and work on strategy and so on and so forth. And if that consultant has worked with many organizations similar to yours, for instance, a consultant will be specialized in the pulp and paper industry or the mining industry or anything like that, they probably will be able to give you some benchmark. But it's very difficult right now publicly to have real good benchmark. There's a Natural Resources Canada that for some sectors, they will say, this is how much that sector emitted in Alberta and Quebec and so on. But those numbers are not good enough for you to know if you are emitting more than the average or less than the average, because it does not take into account all other variables that's specific to your organization. But when we talk about carbon neutrality, comparing yourself to others is of less importance, because what you are really trying to do is try to plan for everything that's feasible in order to come carbon neutral, meaning that you emit the less possible, and then for the rest of it, you might buy offset credit. So that comparison has become less and less important in terms of putting a strategy. 5 years ago was very important. We want to be the best of the gang, right? So you want to know what are the best. But right now we pledge for carbon neutrality, so that becomes a relevant benchmark. And in what we've seen anyway.
Yeah. And sometimes there are some commercial real estate companies recently that have also been sharing their ESG reports, and some have been disclosing their carbon emissions and things like that. But I guess if it's not voluntary, that it's hard to get a full picture. Of course, this is the Discover EE session, EE as in energy efficiency. So of course I have to ask, what is the role of energy efficiency in achieving carbon neutrality?
Obviously, to reach carbon neutrality, you need to do more than one type of action. So the way we can look at it is in 3 overall steps. First, reduce that energy efficiency, and then like maybe an offset credit, something like that for the rest of the GHG emissions that you can't avoid. If we try to segment that into a little bit more type of, we like to call it pillar. The first one are all about reducing the demand for energy. And this is strongly linked to what we do in energy efficiency, but that has to do with asset management, for instance. If you build a new building, try to build it as much with less carbon as possible in terms of operational carbon, for instance. Asset management is also, are you using the good asset for what you need? For instance, if there's a campus of buildings on a university, I need to go and meet you. Well, I won't take the pickup because I don't need a pickup. I don't need to bring anything with me. So I'll try to take a smaller car, reduce the size of the car. So that's all about asset management. Then the second will be energy management. Everything that has to do with energy management system or ISO 50001, in a nutshell, is try to change or switch the culture of the organization so that it will have a culture of energy management. I like to compare it to health and safety. I used to work in the pulp and paper industry, and my elder was telling me when we started our career, there was a lot of injuries in the pulp and paper facilities and manufacturing. And slowly but surely, health and safety became not only something that's important for some people, but for the entire organization. We do have KPIs at the front of the door saying 500 days without incident. Health and safety is part of every meeting with the health and safety minute. The president talks about it, is very important. It's out in the media. So energy management is about changing the culture with regards to energy that will say we're not wasting energy as health and safety did in the past. Then, of course, strictly energy efficiency. Make sure that we have reduced your demand for energy. You'll need efficient equipment. Then I'll go fast on the rest of it. Of course, integrating renewable energy, switching to less carbon intensive energy source, capture and storage in some sector, and carbon offset and so on. So energy efficiency, everything has to reduce the demand and install efficient equipment. And what we've seen when we had the chance to work on strategy that meant to make the organization carbon neutral, I would say about 50% of the path towards carbon neutrality was coming from from either energy management, energy asset management, or energy efficiency. So it's a huge component. And what we've seen is that because of energy efficiency and study we've performed, we've shown that you can slash your emission about half in the financial environment, meaning that the life cycle cost of the measure, it's zero. So meaning that if you implement every project that over their lifetime doesn't cost you a dime, right? Because you save energy and you can recover the cost of the project, you can actually reduce your emission by 50%. And to me, like making sure that everybody understand that is really key, because it's technology that exists, it's know-how that exists, or if they don't exist, they can follow a CIET training. But it means that we can all reduce our emissions by 50% with just energy efficiency in a financially attractive environment.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that does really need to be explained and well comprehended, because when you say it like that, it almost sounds too good to be true. And so for people to wrap their heads around it is important. And I think that's one of the key messages that we need to give, that it is not too good to be true, and get more information in the hands of people, especially more financial analysis so they can see it for themselves. Moving on, I can probably ask you two more questions, I'd say. If we look at carbon neutrality in terms of 3 steps. So if we look at efficiency improvement projects first, renewable energy projects second, and then carbon credits third, which of these do organizations typically struggle with, and why would you say that is? Can you give us a bit of a purview to that?
Yes, of course. I will add few switching to your list, Olivier, because electrification is a part of this discussion throughout Canada as a way to reduce GHG emissions. It depends on what you mean by struggle. People don't understand that energy efficiency project can reduce GHG emissions. And I'm sure that everybody now that listen to the webinar say, wow, we know that. And I know you know it. When you talk to building manager, facility manager, and sadly, even some government officials, make them realize that energy efficiency is about reducing GHG emission. And I've had that discussion many times, and it's always striking me. So I will say that part of the struggling is understanding that reduces energy consumption is a good way to reduce GHG emissions. The other thing that I see that people are struggling with, it seems like there's like waves of hot topics. So first time when I was teaching it was like carbon offset. Everybody was obsessed with carbon offset. We've looked at our building, we've looked at our facilities, we can't really do nothing, or we've done it all. So they think, so they are really interested in where can I buy carbon offset, what are the credible organisms, and so on and so forth. Now, last year, the interest was really around hydrogen. Oh, can I use hydrogen in my buildings? Like, why are you talking about using hydrogen in your building? So the struggling part of it I wanted to bring forward is there's a lot of information about what technology, what process, what financial tool, market tool can bring your organization to carbon neutrality. It's in the media, it's in the specialized magazine, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of noise around the topic, and that evolves because everybody's still learning on how to build a strategy, what's important, and so on. And what I've seen as the client or even participant to the training, the thing they struggle the most with is trying to filter all that noise and try to break it down in things that are credible, tangible, and in order to get to carbon neutrality. And to us in the energy efficiency sector, that's a threat because, like I told you, what we found is that most organizations could cut their emission in around half in a financially attractive way, but that gets bumped out because lots of noise about solar panel, hydrogen, carbon offset, and all those, and planting trees, and so on and so forth. So that's a threat for energy efficiency that could tackle most of the carbon neutrality projects.
Excellent. Last question. In the teaching of the carbon neutrality course, and even just in other decarbonization theme workshops that you've done previously, Geneviève, what are the questions that people seem to be asking time and time again?
Carbon offset. That was short enough as an answer.
That was short enough. I'm going to turn it over to you all and Allison for questions. Just before that, of course, I have to plug this. If you do want to learn more about this, there are 2 Becoming Carbon Neutral courses coming up. If you're interested in that in English, it would be November 9th, in French, December 8th. There's also a new program called Making the Case for Decarbonization Projects, for the exact reason that Geneviève was mentioning, that organizations need to better understand essentially the financial analysis that goes into this so that they can actually see what what kind of projects they should take on and how much carbon will that actually reduce before they do that. And basically, how do you make the case for that? So how do you make the case whether you're an internal employee looking for buy-in from a superior or from some executives or from some senior leaders? And then conversely, if you're a consultant, what do you do? What's the move to get buy-in for a project that you'd like to do for one of your clients?
I would like the participant of the webinar to write in the chat what they think is the average cost per tons of carbon to decarbonize the entire portfolio of building. Is it $5, $10, $1,000, $250? I'm curious to see that.
So while Olivier does that, why don't we get started on some of the questions in the Q&A? And again, I'll remind everybody that wants to ask a question to please enter your questions in the Q&A, and you can upvote the questions that are in there. We've got some really great questions. Thank you so much. That was, I'm sure each one of those questions is its own course. And I know we have so little time to go through it, but I think this question about affordability is really important. And at Efficiency Canada, that's actually one of the narratives that we're seeing as a counter narrative to why you should do energy efficiency. So I love that there is a whole course on that. But if somebody asked you, how is this affordable, or why should I spend the money, or they say it's too expensive, what would you tell them?
Other than the answer to the question, we just ask the participants. We'll wait until they say, but the first carbon neutral strategy we've done was for the federal government for part of their buildings, right? And when we've presented the results first, we have this curve that I would like to show, which is like decarbonization in the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you have the cost, right? And you have a curve. And of course, as you decarbonize, the cost goes up. That's no surprise. Now, the question was about the average, but we all understand the cost will go up. The first part of the graph, which is asset management measures, all in the spectrum of what Efficiency Canada does, was in the negative. So it means, for instance, for the first steps, and the first step goes up to, like I said, around 50%. And that was portfolio of building across Canada. So it's a mix of Alberta building and Nunavut building and so on and so forth. It was in the negative. And when our engineers sent the report, that preliminary report to the government, they sent it back, said there are mistakes. Ask your engineer to do the calculation again. Okay, I'm sorry. Like, why is that? You have negative costs for carbon. It's energy efficiency. If you install a condensing boiler and you increase the efficiency by 10-50%, right? You reduce GHG emission, you also save a lot of costs. And if you have a payback of 5 years and you have the boilers for 25 years, it means that during 20 years, you'll avoid costs that a lot larger than the cost of the retrofit, and you save GHG. This is negative cost carbon. It means you can do that, reduce carbon, and it's financially very attractive. Sadly, we had to discuss that and argue that the cost was negative, and that's how we have to sell it. But in order to sell that idea, you need to explain a lot of different things, right? Financial return, investment, what is energy efficiency? For us, it's trivial, but talking about what is energy efficiency to your friends, your aunt, to some colleagues, sometimes you can't grasp what it is energy efficiency, right? So when you try to explain to somebody that you can reduce carbon and be in the negative cost of carbon, you need to explain a lot of different things. So awareness is very important.
That's a great reminder. And you guys have wonderful courses for that in the background. Okay, if you are an electricity producer, are the emissions from the power generation the power producer's responsibility, or does that emissions responsibility transfer to the purchasers?
The answer might change depending on the jurisdiction, but most of it will be your responsibility. It can't be transferred. There are specific cases, for instance, when there are power purchase agreement that occur between a customer and, so like for instance, a PV farm that's been built that you can exchange credit and the ownership can change, but for most of the time it's not being transferred. Like in Quebec, for instance, if I had natural gas in my home, I don't have to comply to that legislation, right? Because I will be a small consumer, but I'm still burning natural gas. So in that case, the emissions are managed by the distributor, but they have to buy credits to compensate for that through the system that we have, and we are as consumer being charged for that. So it's not the transfer whose emission is that, but there's a financial transfer of the cost.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this question from Rafaela says, in your opinion, should we focus on building retrofits to reduce GHG emissions, both operational and embodied? If so, what policies would you recommend?
It's not an opinion, but it's a fact when you look at what needs to be done in order to limit climate climate change, we have to work on both. So that's not an opinion. Every expert agrees that we have to work on both. Embodied carbon emissions, if you have an existing building, it's quite a challenge, right? Will only be relevant if you do major retrofit or you add an annex to the building and things like that. More and more, it's becoming part of what the community, the building community is doing in their professional work, is to take that into account. The challenge, and it's linked to the policy question. So first, the operational carbon is the one, and I explained it with energy efficiency, that you can have a return on it. So it's very attractive. So of course, I will recommend everybody that's managing a building to work on operational carbon. If you work on a new building, of course, the embodied carbon, I think it's 75% of the carbon footprint will be embodied carbon. So it's very important. But coming back to the policy part of it, in order to have a policy, you need to be able to measure it. Okay, so for instance, if I build a building either with concrete or wood, just to take those two examples, if I were to look at the embodied carbon, I need to know what the carbon footprint of the concrete for a concrete building instead of a wood building. Then the issue comes with there are not enough protocol or standards to really have a credible information about the concrete you buy. What's the carbon footprint of the carbon? So there's a lot of, it's called traceability. So if that concrete comes with material that comes from other countries as well, it's very hard to track down what is the carbon footprint of that specific concrete, for instance, and wood. So if you were to look at embodied carbon right now, there are specialized firms that are starting to have a lot of database that it can you, and they even track some suppliers. Other than that, you'll have to rely on average numbers that are circulating in different papers or articles and so on and so forth. But they are just as good as an average number. It does not take into account the specific product you are actually buying, where it's coming from, where it's been produced, for how long it's been transported, how it's been transported. Was it transported in a ship that was almost empty or full? And there's so many little things that you need to quantify in the value chain that it makes it very hard. So we all should take care of that. Anyway, what I think is that we will need first to have good ways of quantifying that embodied carbon.
I was having some conversations with a couple engineering firms in BC that are working on databases for specific materials, but you're right, it's never going to get to the level of where you actually source that material from. I know Enercan's doing a bit of work on it as well right now.
There are some related life cycle assessment standards and things like that, but they don't directly transfer to embodied carbon, to look at embodied carbon specifically. So they would have to expand to that.
Yeah, but then that life cycle analysis will be just as strong as the data is based on. Some of them, it's like real hard data, and for some of them, it's data that's coming from databases that are good, but that are general, that they can't be specific for what you're doing. Right. So it's evolving.
Thankfully. Okay, so Joshua had a question. So is the comparison to others the basis for any OBPS? I don't know what OBPS means. Hopefully you do. But then Joshua says, I think comparison to peers is a little easier when looking at public companies, or as you say, voluntary disclosures.
I'll just add the OBPS, output-based pricing systems.
Great. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'm not sure I get the idea behind the questions, but it's true that for public company, there are disclosures, so it might be easier to compare it to you. But in the building environment, more and more data now are being collected through the different piece of legislation we have around Canada about energy data reporting that are made mandatory, for instance, in Ontario and now the city of Montreal and so forth. So I would like those organizations to actually publicize or have reports with more specific benchmark. People can compare themselves and know we all want to reach carbon neutrality, but it's also very important for them to know, are they the best of their neighbors? Are they better than their competitors? So now a lot of data are being tracked down, but they are not very used and published in a way that can be used. But in the building environment, another tool that can be used is the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So now there's a lot of credible data in that database. So it's a good way, and they can extract the fact that in one province that is mainly fossil fuel for electricity versus the other, which is hydro, your location, your area, the type of uses in the building. So it is the most complete database for buildings right now. When it comes to industrial, that is a bit more tricky.
Okay, so the last question we have time for is, I think, a little bit more existential and probably practical. Given we only have 8 years until 2030. Should we be focusing on fuel switching first before retrofit if we have limited resources and limited time, because we can fuel switch faster?
By fuel switch, I assume it's meaning like electrification. And if it is, it depends. In some provinces, like the cost of electricity in most provinces is higher than natural gas. So is that the first thing I will do? I'm not sure, because it's not cost effective. And in some provinces, it's not even GHG effective to do that. So the one thing I will do is energy efficiency. And if you can't invest in a deep retrofit and you try to change the culture with ISO 50001, which is really good to reduce energy consumption, numbers are showing now like 15 to 20% in a 3-4 years time period without investment. It's all OAM, like operation and management. Recommissioning in buildings, or look at the waste in the industrial facilities and try to look at the steam pressure. Do you need that of a high pressure? And there's a lot of different things that are covered by experts, are covered by CIET training, that is related to try to go after those energy consumption point with the OAM measures. So if you don't have time, you can't invest, that's the one thing I say, do that, because you probably be able to cut down energy costs and GHG by 20%. So that's what I will do first. Electrification, it's debatable. If everybody electrifies tomorrow, it won't work. The grid in all cities of Canada can't take that. So it's a risk for organization to be subjected to increase in costs quite a bit in future if we just go and electrify in an unsmart way. Everybody seems to agree that it's the way for the future as the grid decarbonize, but the key component of it, the grid has to decarbonize. So we have to be very careful with that, but in your jurisdiction it makes sense because electricity is green and it's cost effective to do that. Please try to do it in an efficient way. So electrify with heat pumps, do not electrify with resistive heating. So then yes, you electrify, you reduce energy consumption as well, because the bottom line is try to use as less energy as we can to offer a service to a building or for a service to a paper machine, for instance, like producing paper.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to you both. As per usual, we don't have enough time for all the questions. To everybody that joined us today, if you want more of Geneviève and Olivier, you can get it. All you have to do is sign up for a CIET course. And we are just so appreciative that you join us for this very short time to share some of your just immeasurable wisdom. So thank you so much to you both. A reminder to everyone, this has been recorded, so it will be put on the website. I would give it about a week's time. And other than that, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.